Hello, everyone. Welcome to an Imperfect Podcast.
Welcome. In this podcast, we're going to be starting a brief mini-series. And as we've been doing with our podcast so far, we have a central question, a crucial question that's going to be guiding the way. And this time, we're going to be exploring the question of what is culture? What is culture? And to do this, we have invited a very special guest to be with us in our conversation, and that is the Reverend Dr. Panayotis Papageorgiou, Proto-Presbyter. Father Panayotis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Father Michael. Thank you, Stradi.
It is wonderful to have you with us. As you may have noticed from the similarity in last names, Father Panayotis also happens to be Strati's father, which is a wonderful coincidence. And I'd like to just take a moment to give you all a sense of Father Panayotis' background, because I think it will help in informing our conversation. So Father Panayotis was born in Cyprus. He received his secondary education at the English school in Nicosia. After his military service, he left for the U.S., where he studied chemical engineering in New York City. He then continued his studies on a graduate research scholarship at the University of Notre Dame, where he completed his master's degree in chemical engineering. He joined Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Boston in August 1984 in order to pursue theological studies, from where he graduated 3 years later with the degree Master of Divinity with high distinction. Following that, he enrolled in the Early Christian Studies program of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He was awarded the PhD degree in February of 1995 with a specialization in the history and theology of the early Christian church. The title of his dissertation was A Theological Analysis of Selected Themes in the Homilies of St. John Chrysostom on the Epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. Father Panayotis was ordained a deacon in Astoria, New York, in 1988, and a presbyter or priest a month later in Orange, New Jersey. He served as a priest on a part-time basis in different Orthodox parishes in the metropolitan Washington area while completing his doctoral dissertation. From April 1989 to December 93, he served a mission parish, which he helped establish in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He moved to Cyprus in December 93, where he served the parish of Ayanapa until 2001, when he returned in July to the U.S. and took up the parish of St. George in Newport Richey, Florida. In August of 2006, he and his family moved to Marietta, Georgia, where he is currently serving as the presiding presbyter of Holy Transfiguration Greek Orthodox Church of Marietta. He's married to Presbytera Catherine, and they have 2 children, Stratis, and a daughter, Olympia. So, Father, we're very, very excited and happy to have you joining our conversation today for the Imperfect Podcast to explore this question of what is culture.
Thank you, Father Michael. It's my honor to be here, and let's see what we can get.
Absolutely. All right, so let's dive in. What is culture? I think the first way to approach this, like we've been doing thus far, is to simply ask, what are some of our first impressions when we hear this word culture? And so let's dive in. Culture.
Yeah, I think that the common, today, culture is very monetized. It's a meme. It's a Facebook post, or rather a Twitter post, Reddit, 4chan, whatever. So that's internet culture. So there's subcultures within culture in the world today, and so then you have the mass media culture, which is the music industry, the cinema, the film industry, and all of that is supposed to be culture, creating culture, and it's all based around consumerism, materialism, and basically making money, or capitalism.
Yeah.
And the culture of the modern world is, so if something isn't making money, it vanishes from the culture
right.
of people and
our attention. it vanishes from our attention.
It vanishes from the attention of everybody. Or doesn't even, if something doesn't make money, it's a side thing, it doesn't even show up in people's, even if it's very good, it doesn't show up in people's, it doesn't show up to their attention.
Yeah, it's hard to get around that connection between kind of popular culture and money, and how, so much of it is bound up in this notion of, consuming, buying, having possessions, having material stuff, and what you wear, fashion, the fashion industry,
that's
how that is kind of part of the fabric of our understanding of culture, music. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with paying a musician to do what they're doing.
No.
But with the kind of advertising industry and all the marketing that goes into that, you start to kind of wonder how much of it is being driven by this desire to make more money and to be more successful.
It also it's what guides people. So people don't really. We don't really think on our own a lot of times as to what culture I listen to, or because culture music defines your culture to some extent. Well, people are guided by the mass money making culture.
Mm-hmm.
They're guided by it. And whereas in the older times, it was just a local village musician who played his instrument, and that was it. That's all they had.
Mm-hmm.
And songs that people sang were common amongst everybody. They weren't produced by some anonymous people in a faraway place and then imported to them through the radio through YouTube, and which is what other people, basically people who are making money, guide our culture today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you're kind of comparing and contrasting is this sort of the centrality of communal living and the community being the kind of thing that generates this culture versus the sort of disintegration of the communal life, the ways in which we kind of make things more anonymous, and there's this kind of outside force coming in to sort of guide things, and that's also often connected with money. Yeah. And again, we don't want to overly demonize money in the sense that even the ancients, had patrons and people
even
that were...
the guy in the village needed to eat.
Right. They all needed to eat, but perhaps we can say, this sense of consumerism and materialism and these things have been driving this in an interesting way. Father, we're excited to have you reflect with us. I don't know if you have any thoughts right off the bat as far as this question of what are some of our first impressions, and then we'll also continue on with a historical
I think that you were both right in saying what you said, and the only thing I want to point out is that the biggest difference today is that all of this culture is universal. All of this culture is piped out through the airwaves or through the internet or through whatever means of communication we have, and the children in Greece are singing the same songs that the children in America, and the children in India are learning the same songs that the children in America, and there is this proliferation of this primarily American culture, although there may be a reverse flow as well, where you get things from other countries into the American setting, but it's mostly from America to the rest of the world, because here is where the money is that produces all these things, and
they have the means.
Yeah, they have the means. Yeah, and so there is this universality of the culture that is created, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's the musical industry, the music industry, or whether it's
cinema.
Yeah, the movies and things like that are basically being transmitted to the rest of the world and kind of making common culture, at least among the youth.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't know what ages I don't know the statistics, but so the universalization of American culture today,
yes,
and bringing it everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very fascinating aspect, that we're kind of creating this global village.
Global village, yeah.
And as far as specifically as far as culture is concerned, that there's this kind of universalization that's occurring where everybody's kind of dressing the same way, listening to the same music, and that so much of this is being driven by the wealth of America and primarily
Hollywood.
About 25 years ago, there was this effort to globalize the economy, and we have globalized the economy. Now we're globalizing culture as well. Okay, this push to bring everything to everywhere, because it's easy to do it, and it also produces money, and it produces money at different levels, so a lot of people are making money out of it. The globalization is effective in many ways, and so people are taking advantage of it. And culture is not exempt from that.
So those are some of the first impressions. We get this sense that culture is cheap, it's fleeting. As you were mentioning, Strati, there are these kind of fastly changing memes and songs that kind of go in and out really quickly.
I'd say internet culture is probably the fastest.
Rapidly moving.
And things just jokes on the internet appear out of nowhere.
Right.
People are doing it for a week and then it's gone.
Right. And behind a lot of this, we're kind of coming to behind a lot of this is a connection with money, is a connection with kind of a monetization of all of this. Facebook and all of these social media platforms are definitely driving a lot of this culture and are driven by money. There's that universal aspect that we talked about, Father, as far as globalizing culture. So those are all kind of interesting first impressions, and certainly we could get into that on so many different levels, exploring statistics and things like that. But this is really just a conversation and getting kind of our feet wet as far as what do you think of when you think of the word culture,
right?
And so that kind of starts us off. I'd like for us to dive a little bit into the historical bit. And before we were on air, we were talking a little bit about this word culture and how it's sort of been developed over time. So before we jump into the historical analysis, maybe we can just very simply state, what does that word culture mean etymologically speaking? So, Father, I don't know if you want to just say a brief word about that.
Yes, it comes from the Latin word cultus, which basically means worship. And for the ancient Greeks as well as the ancient Romans, and then the Greco-Romans before Christianity appears and before Christianity becomes important, their religion and their worship was really the center of their lives. Even for the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, for example, philosophy is the religion of the people. Okay, and then every city, at the center of every city, there was a temple. If you go to the ancient cities in the Middle East and everywhere where they still exist as ruins today, you will see that at the center of every city there was a temple to a god, a goddess, where people gathered to worship their god, who was also the protector of their city, and the cult of that particular deity was at the center of their lives. So as Christianity comes into the picture, and the Christian, especially 4th century Christianity, where it was embraced by Emperor Constantine and subsequently the Greco-Roman Empire, the Roman Empire of that time, which was really, its culture had become more Hellenized, more Greek, because of the introduction of Greek philosophy and the Greek culture of that comes with that. So Christianity enters into this new phase where it's embraced by the Greco-Romans, and it becomes the culture-changing force for the Roman Empire. Okay, so So you move now from, within 70 years, you move from the time that Constantine frees the Christians from persecution, you move from the ancient temple to God, to Zeus or to Athena or to whoever, god of the ancient Greeks and Romans. You move to the replacement of that with a new temple, a Christian temple. And of course, I say temple and not church because the original word used in Greek is naos, and naos means temple. And so the early Christians, they called their, what we call today the churches, they called them nai. So
Still doing Greek.
and still, yeah, and in Greek we still use the same term, but in English we use the word church to denote the building, and that is really not the correct translation when you go from the ancients to the modern. So, so the Christian naos become, the Christian temple becomes the center of their life, and there is a new culture that develops. I mean, if you listen to St. John Chrysostom, he calls this new culture now the new philosophy, the new lifestyle, the new understanding, the new philosophy of life is Christianity. And Christianity begins to shape the life of people, begins to inform their decisions, begins to inform the laws of the government. So the moral aspects or intellectual aspects of Christianity or ascetic aspects of Christianity begin to be incorporated into the lives of people. And a new culture develops, which is both ancient Roman and ancient Greek, but also Jewish, and as well as Christian in its new expression, where Christ is at the center and his resurrection is at the center, and his liberating act of his sacrifice, which liberates us from sin, is at the center. And so you have the development of what we want to call the Roman Christian culture that moves ahead and lasts in many places until today.
So there are so many different things, I think, from what you just said that would be worthy of our discussion and our attention, exploration. Yeah. If we could just kind of rewind to the very beginning, where we just even simply defined the word culture and brought it back to the Latin word cultus, which simply denotes, as Father said, this notion of worship. I don't know how many of our listeners were aware of that, but it is kind of mind-blowing.
No, I didn't know.
Yeah, how many of us, when we think of the word culture, think of worship? I think very few, because of where we're at now with popular culture and the monetization of culture and things like that. So I think before we dig into all of those different components that you mentioned, Father, as far as the ancient Greco-Roman world and how Christianity transformed that, what is this connection between culture and worship, and how can we understand culture as worship? What do we even make of that?
Well, it is very interesting that the transformation of the Greco-Roman society into a Christian society was brought about by this development of culture as we understand it today. Let's say what you do on the everyday basis, that was connected to the calendar of the Christian feasts. Okay, from the very first century, the Christians established the resurrection as a central feast, and then they added to that a few things over the first 300 years, and then with the explosion of Christianity in the 4th century after it was freed, and its ability to now develop its own art, its own architecture, to develop services, and monasticism comes about with the monks having plenty of time to write hymns and write poems and all of this to be put to music, and then at the same time, you have the cult of the martyrs, for example, where we we remember the martyrs in the special feasts that were created, and we remember the ones who sacrificed their lives for Christ, and we put them at the center. Their relics are brought from the catacombs or the places of hiding into the new temples that were built, and they're buried in the altar to sanctify the altar and sanctify the new space for worship. All of these things are elements that create this new understanding and this new culture and this new way of life. And then you have the establishment of the calendar with the feasts, both of the saints as well as the feasts of Christ and the feasts of the Theotokos. It took 2 or 3 centuries for this to be finalized. But by the mid-700s, we have entire services which we still use. We have entire overnight vigils and thousands of hymns that celebrate the resurrection and the birth of Christ and his crucifixion and
Nativity.
and his and the other and his transfiguration, and then also everything related to the Theotokos and everything related to the other saints as they appear through the centuries and they take their place on the calendar. So for the people growing up at that time, all these hundreds of years, the 1,000 years of the Christian Roman Empire, that some people call it Byzantine Empire, and that's another topic we need to leave for another time. But sure. This Christian Roman Empire it contains at the same time the Roman political and Roman legal system, which is transmitted through the government, which is in continuity with the past and has never been broken. That continuity has never been broken, like it happened in the West after the 400s, the early 400s.
With the fall of Rome.
With the fall of Rome and
city Rome.
And the lost
territories
of the territories, the loss of the territories of the West through the invasions of the barbaric tribes of the Germans that were coming from the north, and the destruction of civilization in the West, complete destruction of civilization. We call it the Dark Ages. For about 400 years, there's complete destruction. They lost their connection with the Greek philosophers and their connection with their civilization they had before. They remained Christians, but they were also struggling to keep the Christianity because some of these Germanic tribes were either pagans or they were heretics. They were Arians and other groups that were outside the boundaries of the Christian Roman Empire, and they now had the ability to come back and conquer. So we can look at that 400 years of what we call the Dark Ages and what happened to the West. We can look at it at a separate time. But my point I was trying to make today is that within the Christian Roman Empire, which became primarily Greek-speaking eventually as it lost its Latin, as on the West, whatever was in the West, it lost its Greek. So we have a civilization developed, which is a Christian civilization, where everything reflects their faith in Christ. Everything reflects the feasts of the church. Everything reflects the Christian expression of what it is to be living that life of Christianity.
Right.
And so the cultus is Christianity. The cultus is Christ at the center as the God-man who has lived on earth and died on the cross and rose from the dead and liberated us from sin. And now we have a chance to become like that and be liberated from sin. So the culture reflects this effort to be liberated from sin. It reflects this effort to live a life that is better than the Roman, all the things that were happening in the pre-Christian Roman times.
Right.
And even let me give you just one example of how there is a transformation of culture by Christianity at this point. For the Romans, their name days were for the Romans, their birthdays were very important. Their birthdays, they celebrated their birthdays. It was an exchange of gifts. It was they were throwing big parties. The emperors were big at that, and the more wealthy Romans were big at that. The poorer ones, of course, didn't have the means to do much, but the birthdays were very important, very central to their lives. As Christianity takes over and transforms culture into the Christian understandings, this egotistical centrality on the person, individual, moves to the centrality of the saints. And name days take a central place in the lives of people. And now the people don't celebrate their birthdays. And this went on for centuries, and even until the modern times in Christian countries of the Eastern Christianity, birthdays were abandoned. And growing up in Cyprus when I was a child, we never celebrated my birthday. I didn't even know when my birthday was, because my name day was more important, and the saint that I was named after was more central in that. And going to church to receive communion on that day was more important than.
And in a way, the name, the saint day is the birthday of the saint into heaven.
Yes,
right.
Yes,
so it's eternal birthday.
It's a higher level of birthday. We're no longer celebrating our birth into this world. We're celebrating our birth into the kingdom of God.
Yes, so absolutely.
That's what a name day is.
So Father, in all that you have just said, I think what I hear is this sense of prioritizing in a very concrete way, individual people and a whole society prioritizing their time and their space, right? In other words, their time from the sense of the liturgical calendar, that they had this sense that the Lord's Day was the central day. Kyriaki, Lord's Day was the first day of the week. It was the pinnacle. It represented the eighth day of creation, the resurrection, and everything sprang from that.
Yes.
And then on a festal cycle that throughout the year, everything was marked by the seasons of the feasts and the fasts. And that from a spatial perspective, you could say the church, the actual temple, was the central gathering place.
Yes.
So time and space are given this are marked by the sacred as being the priority.
Central. It's central in their lives.
Right.
Okay. So baptisms take a major. They become central in their lives as they baptize their children, for example, and that becomes a great feast. Weddings become central in the sense that, again, a sacrament is performed and there is an understanding of sanctification, and they gather together to celebrate that. And then, of course, the feasts are important because, for example, Holy Week, even Orthodox Americans, they come if they can, and and they take a piece from here and a piece of there. And if it happens to fall on, let's say, on spring break, they take their children and go to Florida, or they go to the Bahamas, or wherever, because it's the only time they can as a family to do. And Holy Week is not even important to them.
Well, they might get back in time for the Pascha service, but
yeah.
They missed everything else.
That's correct. But for the early Christians and the Christians who continue that tradition in the transformation of society, as we see the transformation of society, Holy Week becomes an immersion in the celebration of the remembrance of those things. And Holy Week is if you look at it carefully, you realize that there is an effort through the services to transport us back in time and place us at the events. So there is a transcendence of time in that sacred space of the temple, the Christian temple, the naos, the church. There is a transformation of time so that it can bring us back to that time and place us at the feet of the cross, so that we can feel and understand and experience what happened, to put us at the opening of the cave where the tomb where Christ is risen, and give us that joy that the women who discover the angels at the entrance of the tomb receive as they find out that the Lord has risen. And so, if you really immerse yourself in Holy Week, which is coming up for us, and we need to immerse ourselves in it, you will realize that this was not the way it was set up. It was not accidental. There is an inspiration from the Holy Spirit, I believe, which gives an opportunity to people to be transformed through this process of immersing themselves in Holy Week. And therefore, the Christians, up to this day in Christian countries, they take off from work on Holy Week and they immerse themselves in the services.
Right.
And the church has also accommodated them because they needed to go to work and take care of their animals or go take care of whatever. So the church moved some of the morning services to the evening so that we can be able to attend. So there is really no excuse not to attend so that you can actually benefit from it. And I can tell you from my experience that people have been completely transformed as they allowed themselves to immerse themselves in Holy Week and the services and experience first what happened in the sense of the betrayal of Christ, the arrest of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, and then the time waiting for the resurrection. That, because even Holy Saturday has a very special feeling to it as you are waiting for the event that's going to happen at midnight when you go to church and the lights go out. And suddenly the light comes from the altar and fills the room, fills the space, the sacred space, and the chanting of Christ is risen from the dead just reverberate throughout and touch the heart. It's an amazing experience if you allow yourself to get through it. And that's what the church did, which transformed society in those 1,000 years of the Christian Roman Empire before Constantinople fell, and subsequently in those places where those traditions were kept and experienced by people. And there are some places in the world that they still have that.
Yeah. I wonder, Father and Strati, if part of the reason why someone might take off for the Bahamas during a Holy Week and not attend has to do with this lack of experiencing or tasting the transformative effect of when you prioritize your time and your space. In other words, when you put Christ concretely as the primary, as the first thing in your calendar. Sunday is the first day, right? And then the feast days and things like that. And when you put the church in the center of the village, as it were, then, hearkening back to what you were talking about with the feast days allowing us to transcend time, in many ways, we're by entering into this sacred time and this sacred space, we're actually able to transcend the prison of time and space and to commune with God who's beyond time and space. And then by doing that, it then brings that sacredness back into our lives, both individually but also societally. Yeah. And it spreads it and transforms us as individuals and transforms the entire culture. So being able to actually taste that if I do this, I'm going to be transformed and those people around me are going to be transformed. And as you said, this whole 1,000-year stretch of the Eastern Roman Empire was able to see the effects, the impact that this kind of prioritizing gave on the lives of individuals and the lives of an entire society.
Yes, and I think that's basically where our society today, at least in the United States, where we're so few, and I think our parishioners are affected more by pop culture and by political culture
that's another one.
And by the non-Orthodox cultures that are around us, in their language, even in their theology sometimes, and definitely in the way they worship, because they would come to church on Sunday expecting to hear a long sermon like the Protestant church across the street does. And if they don't hear a long sermon, then they say, why aren't the Greek priests giving longer sermons, but they miss the entire service, which is an hour and a half. Okay, right. Plus Orthodox another hour and a half. It's 3 hours. They miss the entire immersion in worship, so they miss the possibility of being touched by God.
Right.
And they are hoping that they may be touched by the words of the preacher.
Yeah, it's a different culture.
Yeah, it's a different.
They're used to. Yeah, the culture is liturgical for us.
Well,
yes,
and for many Protestants, it is not all.
Yes, but the interesting thing, I think this is maybe where we'll talk about this next time, is that in many ways, even people who are not liturgical as far as religious worship is concerned, are liturgical as far as their everyday lives are concerned. Sure. And we were talking about how the malls and the arenas and stadiums and things have sort of replaced the church as a place of central place of worship. And so whereas someone might show up late to a liturgy and just want to catch the sermon and not seek that transformation, they would easily immerse themselves in the liturgical act of going to the mall for 3 hours. And I'm not saying that in any kind of sort of judgmental
nothing wrong with going to the mall sometimes.
Right. But it's interesting how the mall has some very distinct similarities to our own liturgical worship, and the kind of way that it's set up, and even in kind of a cathedral style, there are people who've studied this, as far as the similarities, and so it's not even so much a matter of whether or not we are immersing ourselves in liturgical worship. It's more of a matter of what kind of liturgical worship are we.
Yes, that's very good. That's very good.
I like that.
Because why is this happening? It's because the human being needs that.
Right.
It needs a structured liturgy of life where they do certain things in a certain way. So you come into the church, you light a candle, you take a place in the church, you repeat hymns, you repeat prayers. You go to the mall, you do something similar. You go to the
park.
You park your car, you enter through the gate, whatever that is, which is decorated like a royal gate. Mm-hmm. There are pictures of the things that are happening inside.
The saints.
Yeah.
Pictures of the happy people.
The happy people who are going to make you happy too. Right. And then you enter into this amazing space. You go to the food court to eat. So your senses have to participate in these different things, which is really a mimicking of exactly what has happened for centuries, for thousands of years in the worship of the human being, whether it was before Christianity or the Christian culture of worship, mm-hmm. which involves the senses and the participation of the person in a special way. So yes, but it's interesting that you're saying this, because I think that I don't think anyone will actually arrive late at a game in the stadium downtown.
No.
But people will arrive late at the church.
Right.
And by so doing, they're going to miss those special moments when the game is at its heights and there is something for them to experience.
Right.
If they were to go late to the game. And when they come late to the church, they miss those high points when God can touch them and transform them. And I think people don't realize how much they're missing by just delaying their arrival. Yeah, delaying their arrival for no reason, really, because, they get up 15 minutes later, they take a little longer to get dressed, they take a little longer to drive, and they're not in a rush to get there at the beginning of the liturgy, and therefore they arrive much later, and they miss the reading, they miss the great entrance of the holy gifts, and they miss the experience of that liturgical experience where all their senses will have participated, and then they will have allowed God to touch them and transform them and heal them from whatever things are happening to them, and restore them to a healthy human existence that can actually help them for the next week, for the difficulties of the week coming up.
So on an individual believer's level, that experience of culture, quote unquote, in other words, worship, is what can truly transform their lives and then ultimately the lives and the environment around them. And I think that's perhaps where we can conclude this series.
I want to just say that, and I think for the next one, we can get into the more specifics, possibly, of the specifics of what the church did, just like how they changed the music culture, for instance, how they changed dance culture, for instance,
yes,
how they changed architecture, art, paintings. We can go into all those details. We could go on forever, really.
Right. Go one step deeper.
Yeah, one step deeper, and I think that's what we should do next time.
Yes,
and talk about how the culture that was born within the Roman Empire was a culture that was surrounded or had as its center the kingdom of God, and stopped worshiping the world.
Right.
And the creation.
And the creation. And the creation.
Yeah.
And that how that affects art, music, and everything. So
yes.
I think
massive ripple effect.
Right. And which lasts till today. We're still doing.
Yeah, and if you're going to get into some of the theological things, you can talk about the role of the material world, the transformation of the material world by the incarnation of Christ, by the fact that God became man and walked on earth.
Right, the philosophy behind theological philosophy, if you may.
Yeah, how that changes
the mentality
of people, and also moves us from the ancient Greek philosophy,
humanistic,
which is more humanistic, to a new philosophy of life, which God is at the center, and everything that people do consider God first. In an expression I remember as a child hearing all the time is Theou thelondos, Theou thelondos, Theou thelondos, God willing, God willing. Whatever God wants, it's like surrendering to the will of God instead of
God first.
Yeah, putting God first, which reflects the centrality of faith and the centrality of the worship of God, which is also reflected in the fact that the worship center, the worship space, is at the center of the village, and people gather from all directions to that point and come together to meet each other and to exchange the keys of peace and to experience the presence of God and to learn and to also worship God and do all those things. So it's quite interesting how
there's a lot.
Yeah, how life can change when you change your perspective from I want to have more material things to may God be at the center and whatever the will of God be. Let it be.
And we've only been for about 43 minutes, and yet we haven't even scratched the surface of the entire topic, but it's still a good time, I think, to wrap it up.
So all of that and more.
A lot more.
On our next episode.
And I think we're excited.
We are.
I think we just got excited. and we're enticing ourselves. I don't know if you guys listening care, but we really want to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting to discover what Christians did in the early centuries. And how can that help us today when we live in a world which is moving away from the Christian lifestyle and the Christian understanding of the world.
Right.
So if you want to be a Christian, you need to go back to the early Christian times and look at those Christians and say, how did they do it? So what happened to them? How did they retain their faith? How did the church actually retain itself for 1,000 years before the fall of Constantinople? And how did they manage to do such a thing, to be one church and to remain intact and not to fall into pieces and be destroyed?
And it was no easy task.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was,
because there were heresies and there were ideas. Ideas are always floating around, and people want to push their own idea.
Like today.
Yeah. So just like today,
nothing's really.
Yeah. So how did they do it? I think it's really in the culture. The development of culture is very essential. All right, and we can talk about some of the things that are happening today in our world, and if you go back to countries that have been Orthodox for the last 2,000 years, and the people are still immersed in that way of thinking, when you confront them with a new idea that somebody else is doing in the United States today, they say, "What on earth are you doing?" You know, that is not good for you.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and they know in their gut that that is not good for you.
Right.
They cannot explain it theologically.
Right.
But
Something doesn't sit
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
it's not right. Why isn't it right? Well, they can't explain it all the time, but
No.
they can tell you, well, we haven't done it that way ever because this works. Okay?
Yeah.
And why change something that works?
Right.
So that's part of that cultural development, if you want to call it that, that safeguards
Consciousness, a cultural
consciousness, yeah, that safeguards the faith, safeguards the truths of the faith, and safeguards the practices that bring you to the truth of the faith and enable you to meet God and converse with Him and be in His presence.
So all that and
all
much,
that,
much
and
more.
much more to come.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for having me on the program.
Thank you, Father, for being with us.